What historical fact makes you cry? I learned about this in a Dan Carlin podcast. During the German-Soviet War, there was a Red Army soldier who sang each night with a hauntingly beautiful voice. His comrades would give him their tea rations and scarves to protect his larynx. One night, he couldn't sing because he had gotten sick. A German soldier crawled across no man's land and tossed something into the Soviet trench. The Soviet soldiers thought it was a grenade. However, it was a package containing a letter asking if the singer was okay and if he needed medicine. A truly heartwarming moment in an otherwise horrific front. I'm glad to come across the occasional wholesome story in amongst all of these depressing tales. This soldier, I realized, must have had friends at home and in his regiment, yet he lay there deserted by all except his dog. I looked on, unmoved, at battles which decided the future of nations. Tearless, I had given orders which brought death to thousands. Yet here I was stirred, profoundly stirred to tears. And by what? By the grief of one dog. Napoleon Bonaparte, on finding a dog beside the body of his dead master, licking his face and howling, on a moonlit field after a battle. Napoleon was haunted by this scene until his own death. Napoleon had a funny relationship with dogs. He feuded with his wife's pug, had his life saved by a Newfoundland, wrote an op-ed about how not liking dogs made you a disloyal person, but also made it illegal to name a dog after him. Then there was this tidbit, and finally the fact that he kept a dog in his exile that he would take long walks with. Once, during a naval engagement, he even surrendered to a dog. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The doors to the exit and the stairwells were locked. So you either had to jump out the window or be burned alive. Sadly, it takes a tragedy to enact change. The Triangle Shirtwaist fire is why all buildings must have outward opening doors that cannot be locked. Edit, doors cannot be locked from the inside, there must be a source of egress for those in the building. I'm sure I'm paraphrasing, but regulations are written in blood. The story of Joe O'Reilly. Joe was tested and found to have an IQ of 46, and the mind of a 6-year-old. Despite this, Joe O'Reilly was executed at the age of 23 by the state of Colorado. In addition, Joe was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted and the victim of a coerced confession. Joe's mental challenges were so significant that he didn't even understand he was about to die as they walked him to the gas chamber. While held on death row during the appeals process, O'Reilly often played with a toy train, 9, given to him by prison warden Roy Best. The warden said that O'Reilly was the happiest prisoner on death row. 7. He was liked by both the prisoners and guards. Best became one of O'Reilly's supporters and joined the effort to save his life. 6. He said of O'Reilly before his execution, he probably didn't even know he was about to die. All he did was happily sit and play with the toy train I had given him. 1. For his last meal, O'Reilly requested ice cream. When questioned about his impending execution, he showed blank bewilderment. 7. He did not understand the meaning of the gas chamber, telling the warden no, Joe won't die. 10. He was reported to have smiled while being taken to the gas chamber. Momentarily nervous, he calmed down when the warden grabbed his hand and reassured him. 7-11, whenever I think about him smiling and walking to his death, it makes me fucking ill. And deeply ashamed of the system of governance that allowed it to happen, even 80 years removed from it. What a disgrace, man. Never heard of him, but fuck, that's depressing. I must be confusing this execution with another one. Long ago, I read about a mentally challenged man being executed. He was given his last meal, but didn't eat the dessert, telling the guards he was saving it for later. RMS Carpathia was the first ship to arrive on the scene when the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. Every one of the Titanic's 705 survivors were rescued by Carpathia, which made a tremendously heroic effort that night in the North Atlantic. The scene is dramatized in A Night to Remember, the classic film from 1958, and one of the more accurate, especially given the constraints of technology at that time. Harold Cottam, the radio operator on Carpathia, had already gone off duty when the Titanic's distress signals were received. He immediately conveyed the message to Captain Arthur Rostron, who jumped out of bed and ordered the ship to change course. There's this Tumblr post that summarizes what happened next far better than I could. I had to sit down and stare at a wall for a while when I first read it. I cannot live with myself if I do anything less. Wow. Then there was the Californian. They were only 5 miles or so from the Titanic and had spotted her in the night. Unfortunately, the radio operator had gone to bed and nobody was able to hear the Titanic's distress call. The Titanic tried to get the attention of Californian by firing rockets, but Californian's captain didn't think they were a distress signal. The Californian left. Some reports say that Californian was much farther away, and it and Titanic didn't spot each other, but both spotted some other mystery ship between them that still hasn't been identified. Sacagawea, who accompanied Lewis and Clark on their expedition to explore the lands we now know as the Western United States, had a vital coincidence on the journey that always makes me emotional to think about. She was born a Shoshone but was taken around the age of 12 and made a slave to the Hidatsa. After being with them for 3 or so years, she was sold to a French man named Toussaint Charbonneau, who took her as a wife. When Lewis and Clark met her, she was about 16 years old and pregnant with Charbonneau's child. The birth was a tough one and Lewis helped with the child's safe delivery before Sacagawea and Charbonneau joined them on the expedition. Lewis and Clark knew they would meet the Shoshone on their journey and were hoping Sacagawea could help them procure some supplies, especially horses, to help them cross the Rocky Mountains. Sacagawea didn't speak English. She spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa. Charbonneau spoke Hidatsa and French, and one of the members of Lewis and Clark's expedition spoke French and English. Suffice to say, translation was complicated and complex. When the expedition finally came upon the Shoshone's territory, they agreed to meet and hear Lewis and Clark's proposal. They sat down around the fire and began negotiations. The chief of the tribe began to speak with Sacagawea and the conversation proceeded rapidly. The others, unable to really understand what was going on, were confused when she and the chief began to cry, and then to embrace. In the years since her capture, it turned out, Sacagawea's brother had become chief. He had believed her dead and she did not recognize him at first. The celebration, when the tribe learned who she was, and the appreciation bestowed upon Lewis and Clark for returning her, is hard to completely express. From Wikipedia, Lewis recorded their reunion in his journal, shortly after Captain Clark arrived with the interpreter Charbonneau, and the Indian woman, who proved to be a sister of the chief Kamiawait. The meeting of those people was really affecting, particularly between Sacagawea and an Indian woman, who had been taken prisoner at the same time with her, and who had afterwards escaped from the Minataries and rejoined her nation. Whenever I start to think about what she went through, from her capture and slavery among the Hidatsas, to her being taken as a wife by Charbonneau, traveling across largely unknown lands with people whose language she didn't speak, to finally being reunited with her family, it always makes me emotional. She went through so much. A child wife, at that. Most if not all the astronauts aboard the Challenger survived the explosion. It was the crash into the water that would have killed them. I was going to mention this too, except in the context that it never should have happened. The night before the launch, NASA talked with Morton Thiokol engineers. They made the solid rocket boosters. The engineers were very concerned about the weather conditions. The lowest temperature the shuttle had ever launched in was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The conversation turned around to, can you prove there will be problems if we launch? And engineers had to say no, there was no proof there definitely would be problems. So they proceeded with the launch. The melted O-ring made a temporary seal, which held for about 40 to 50 seconds. If there hadn't been a strong wind shear aloft that broke the seal loose, there's a chance they might have made it to space. The worst part is that the solid rocket boosters had a history of O-ring blow-by. This was not the first time O-rings did not seal correctly. It was the first time it completely failed. NASA knew of the problem, but they didn't prioritize trying to fix it. NASA put politics and money in front of human safety. It was the first time 13-year-old me saw it. I believed what I'd read, that NASA always put human safety first. It utterly shattered my view of them. When Columbia broke up on re-entry, I wasn't surprised. This makes me so upset, because it was so preventable, but they met likely a painful death, through impact. And the teacher, and her students watching. Just miserable. Subscribe for more hot Reddit takes in your inbox, guaranteed.